Today on the Perception and Action podcast, revisiting the concept of automaticity. Does it still have relevance to understanding skilled performance? Should the goal of training really be to get a performer to a stage where they're doing things automatically? Or is it time to move on from this concept? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. On today's episode, I want to revisit one of the most well-studied and commonly used terms in skill acquisition, automaticity. UCLA basketball coach John Wooden once famously said, "The importance of repetition until automaticity cannot be overstated. Repetition is the key to learning." Do we still really believe that? In Fitz and Posner's highly influential model of skill acquisition, automaticity is the final stage, the peak of the summit you're trying to reach. If we accept that learning is actually more nonlinear than models like this suggest, and that skill involves a constant process of adaptation, do we really still believe that elite performance lies exclusively at the top of the automaticity peak? If we take an information processing approach to skill performance, is it really the case that expert performance is purely automatic, with cognitive processes no longer involved? And if we take an ecological approach, where we don't think these processes are ever involved in skill motor action in the first place, is the concept of automaticity any use at all? Is it time to retire the concept of automaticity and send it off to the legends section of the Motor Learning Hall of Fame? Thanks for the memories, but we've moved on. Today, I want to tackle this issue from both sides of the skill acquisition fence. First, I want to look at a couple recent papers that challenge the role of strict automaticity from an information processing perspective. Even if this is not the skill approach you align with, I think it's important to understand these ideas about skill and how they differ from the other view, the ecological approach, of course. For that, I'm going to end the episode by briefly discussing how I think the concept of automaticity fits there. The first paper I want to look at is one published by Pacare and Myopoulos earlier this year. In it, their main goal was to argue that controlled and automatic processes are not distinct ends of the skill acquisition journey. Instead, they're constantly interacting with each other no matter what stage you're at. To make this point, the authors begin by contrasting a habit and a skill, something I discussed back in episode 109. Before getting to that, just a reminder about what we mean by controlled versus automatic processes in information processing models. Think about trying to make a basketball free throw when you're taught in the traditional prescriptive manner. You need to remember all of the steps your coach told you. Stand with your feet apart, bend your knees, keep your eyes on the rim, raise your arms above your head, snap your wrist on the follow-through, etc. These instructions must be held in working memory and used by shifting your attention to your different body parts. Thus, there is a high degree of executive cognitive control involved. This in turn makes the execution slow and inefficient. Think about having to access your hard drive and pull stuff out of memory every time you want to do something on your computer. And it tends to be error prone. With so many things to remember and focus on, it's very easy to get distracted, do things in the wrong order, forget a step, etc. With practice, however, it is proposed that these distinct steps are grouped into proceduralized knowledge that can be accessed and run without the need for cognitive control, working memory or attention. They become automatic. You can do it without really thinking about it. To quote the paper, Practice leads to an improvement in the ability to rapidly select appropriate actions and to execute them accurately, while at the same time leading to greater speed, fewer errors, and higher efficiency, i.e. a reduction of the cognitive load required to perform the task." End quote. As the authors of the paper point out, this low level of cognitive load involved in action control is also characteristic of habits too. For example, there's not really much cognitive control going on when you chew on your fingernails. So what separates a skill from a habit? In the author's view, this is why the controlled versus automatic dichotomy falls apart. Quote, "Habitual actions are typically characterized as automatic, inflexible, and stimulus-driven. By contrast, although there are elements of automaticity in skill, skill actions remain goal-directed and highly flexible. The skilled agent is capable of responding appropriately to novel or unusual situations. A characteristic of skilled actions as sharing some of the properties of habits, such as speed, accuracy, and efficiency, while at the same time remaining goal-directed and flexible, suggests that skills involve a particular form of interplay between automatic and cognitive control processes." End quote. With purely automatic habits, there's no real path to learning and improvement either. Quote, "It is of the essence of merely habitual practices that one performance is a replica of the predecessors. It is the essence of skillful practices that one performance is modified by its predecessors. There is an element of deliberate practice and desire for mastery that is not present with a habit. As the authors say, do you continually strive to fold the laundry, a habit, more quickly? If you had this as a goal, you would likely switch to it being a skill. You would devote some cognitive resources to figuring out the steps that could be changed and deliberately practice these. So in other words, elite performance can never be truly automatic if you want to be flexible and intelligent and still allow for room for improvement. Otherwise, it would be reduced to a quote-unquote dumb habit. This requires that most skills we perform will involve a mix of controlled and automatic processes with interaction between them rather than one or the other. To allow for this flexibility and improvement in performance, the authors argue that this is based on three types of sensitivity in our action control. Sensory sensitivity, we must be able to change our actions in response to immediate changes in our sensory information in the environment. Situation sensitivity, we must be able to take into account higher level aspects of the situation and context. For example, what play an opposing football team is running against us. Finally, we need strategic sensitivity. That is, we must be able to change the execution of our actions as our goals or intentions change. For example, to play more aggressively or defensively in tennis in relation to your opponent's strengths. Note here, there's no motor sensitivity. That is, being able to flexibly alter the pattern of coordination to achieve the same goal. So how does this interaction between controlled and automatic processes work in the author's model? Quote, "Though the move from novice to expert does involve an increased automaticity, it does so in a way that involves the freeing up of cognitive resources that allows for a different mode of engagement via cognitive control processes. We argue that what distinguishes highly skilled from less skilled performers and novices, e.g. the professional tennis player from the amateur or the beginner, is the structural complexity and accuracy of their mental representations in their domain of expertise." End quote. For this, the authors have developed a model that involves a hierarchy of representations and three main stages of action, each corresponding to a different intention. So-called D-intentions are more abstract, conceptual representation of action goals. P-intentions are more concrete, contextualized representations of goals that integrate perceptual information about the situation of action. And M-intentions encode action goals in a motoric format directly suitable for action execution. D-intentions are responsible for strategic control, P-intentions for situational control, and M-intentions for motor control. Importantly, the role of cognitive process does not follow a hierarchy, with more being involved with the strategy at the top and less being involved with motor control at the bottom. Instead, quote, "The cognitive automatic control gradient need not be aligned with the action representation hierarchy, and that the interplay of cognitive and automatic control processes can be more flexible and heterarchical. In other words, humans will flexibly adapt the use of cognitive and automatic control across the levels of behavior to suit the demands of the task at hand." Their model is also heavily based within the traditional one ideal technique motor program ideas of action. Quote, "In this view, motor implementation is only indirectly shaped by cognitive control, in that it triggers one set of motor routines over another, depending on what the agent intends to do. The rest occurs automatically by way of heavily conditioned reflex-like responses. So what is involved in the action representation developed by experts, the key to skill in the author's view? In their paper, the authors distinguish two types. First, structured action representations, or SARs, which are, quote, representations of actions that form part of the motor repertoire in the relevant skill domain, e.g. a sliced forehand in tennis, and support action implementation. And second, internal models of action selection. Looking more closely at SARs for action implementation, they are essentially Schmidt's motor programs or schemas. Quote, SARs are both representational and control structures. A well-formed SARs is a hierarchically organized assemblage of motor schemas. End quote. Since I haven't talked about them in a while, a bit of a review. Motor schemas involve representations that encode the general form or pattern of an action. That is, the features of a motor skill that remain constant across its executions. These invariant features of an action include aspects such as the order and relative timing of the different phases of the movement, as well as their general spatial configuration. Continuing with a quote from the paper, in contrast, most superficial aspects of the movements will change from one occasion to the next. These variable or surface features of a motor act correspond to the parameters of a motor schema. On different occasions, the parameters will take different values, determining how the motor schema will be expressed. The surface features that need to be specified each time the movement is performed include elements such as the movement speed, its amplitude, its direction, or the end effector used. End quote. In schema theory, it's proposed that every time you make a movement, you store in memory information about the initial conditions, the parameter values you tried to use for the movement, the outcomes of the action, and the sensory feedback you received. From this, you develop a set of mapping rules. To quote the paper, for example, after sufficient practice throwing balls to different distances, a mapping rule relating parameter values to outcome distances will have been acquired. Motor schemas can become more and more fine-tuned over time and can be successfully deployed even when novel conditions are encountered. End quote. So in other words, by storing all this information from several throws you make in practice, you abstract a rule related to the distance parameter of the movement. For example, the force you apply to your arm muscles. Using this rule, you can then throw to any distance within your force capacity, even if you've never done it before. Automaticity in schema theory comes via chunking, where all these features are integrated into a single representational unit. But importantly, the authors propose that this still allows for intentional intervention. That is, if the performer's intention changes during the course of an action, they can exert cognitive control over the motor schema. For example, if I initiated a plan for a hard forehand in tennis, but at the last second decided I wanted to make a drop shot. In the author's view, expertise lies in the richness of these SARS representations and the interaction between cognitive and automatic processes. Quote, thus, one hallmark of expertise lies in the superior quality of the action representations that mediate skilled performance. Well-structured action representations allow performers to select better movements, to better anticipate action effects and future events, and thus to better and more finely monitor and control various aspects of their performance. Expertise is not just a matter of how accurately one executes selected actions, however, it's also a matter of selecting appropriate actions in the first place. End quote. So these representations are internal models. In the paper, the authors actually give a definition I really like of this. Internal models are mental representations of the causal structure of the environment, supporting predictions concerning potentially probabilistic action outcomes. Internal models can be used to compute on the fly the optimal action given the structure of the environment and the agent's goal. End quote. In their model, the second type of representation controls action selection. These are developed through extensive experience with a task and through learning situational probabilities, strategies, knowing your opponent's strengths and weaknesses, etc. Quote, we propose that a second mark distinguishing experts from ordinary mortals is that experts have acquired very detailed and accurate models of their domain at both the strategic and the situational or tactical levels. Thus, while SARs guide the implementation of selected shots, say a drop shot, Internal models are used to decide on the strategy and tactics of the game, from the overall strategic decision to play aggressively from the baseline, all the way to the tactical decision to win the point with a final drop shot." End quote. The final part of their model is essentially a type of metacognition the authors call MetaControl. That is, the ability to monitor action processes and dynamically alter the balance between cognitive and automatic control. This choice of the balance between these two is based on a metacognitive cost-benefit analysis. Using cognitive control is more costly in terms of the resources it uses and the time it requires, so it should be used only when the anticipated rewards, for example, changing intention to win a point, outweigh those costs. One way this type of metacognitive process has been implemented in models of motor control is by tracking the degree to which the predicted sensory consequences of an action correspond to the actual sensory feedback received. Quote, "In the course of building up their SARs through practice, training, and performance, the skilled agent will have acquired precise mappings between relevant environmental properties, action parameters, and expected sensory consequences of movements. We should expect, then, that the skilled agent is able to more readily detect when their execution of an action is going less smoothly than anticipated, and when they should intervene with the help of cognitive control resources." End quote. This is something I'm actually going to devote a full episode to in the future. A couple final points the authors make. In their opinion, this ongoing negotiation between automatic and controlled processes during action control fits well with the idea of flow. That is a state of effortful absorption, where the skill is not completely unconscious, but is not highly controlled and demanding either. They also use their model to emphasize the importance of variability in training. Quote, "Variation rather than mere drill and repetition, as well as critical attitude and understanding, are crucial to the acquisition of skill, because they are crucial to the acquisition of fine-tuning of accurate SARs and accurate models of the domain of the skill." End quote. As I've said many times on the podcast now, the benefits of variability of practice can be understood from both an information processing and self-organization approach to motor learning. It just accomplishes different things and is implemented differently in each. Before I talk about what all this means for the concept of automaticity, I want to look at a second recent article to address these issues from an information processing perspective. This was a paper published earlier in 2020 by John Toner and Aidan Moran. Aidan, who has written many interesting papers in this area, sadly passed away earlier this March. The authors begin their paper in a similar manner to the one I just described, presenting the commonly held belief that skilled performance is characterized by an absence of conscious attention and cognitive control to the mechanics of one's movements during skill execution, and that this fits, pun intended, with the dominant theories of skill acquisition, where controlled and automatic processes are at the beginning and end of the skill acquisition continuum, respectively. As the authors note, this idea can be traced all the way back to William James in the late 1800s, with his distinction between what he called willed actions, which involve a conscious component, and ideomotor actions, where the person is aware of nothing between the conceptions and execution. But like the first paper, Toner and Moran disagree with this dichotomy. Quote, "However, we argue that this perspective is unable to account for the wide range of empirical evidence, which indicates that performance continues to be mediated by controlled processes, even after one attains expertise. We seek to address this misunderstanding by presenting a model which explains how controlled and automated processes may emerge concurrently and must operate in a synergistic fashion if experts are to overcome the challenges they face in seeking to maintain performance proficiency over long timescales." End quote. So, if skill acquisition does not involve a gradual reduction in the cognitive resources used until it essentially reaches zero, the state of automaticity, what is involved? In the paper, the authors appeal to a 2005 model by Bebko, which instead of cognitive processes being followed by automatic ones, the two emerge at the same time. Quote, "Control processes refer to the processes that enable adaptation within cognitive schema or motor programs, rendering the programs flexible so that one can respond to changing external or internal demands while still executing the quote-unquote same behavior." End quote. So like in the earlier model I discussed today, the two work together. In their view, behavior lies in an area formed by two continuum, low versus high automaticity and low versus high control. Toner and Moran focus on two specific contexts in which they feel this synergistic interaction between control and automatic processes is essential. The first is when performers seek to update and improve their motor execution. In their view, the maintenance and continued improvement of a skill requires that these processes operate in orthogonal fashion rather than an automatic skill being completely locked away. Quote, performers must retain an awareness of their corporeal schema to ensure that everything continues to run smoothly, and they have little choice but to consciously intervene, especially when they encounter a variety of what might be termed bodily crises. Examples include injury, performance slumps, and the aging body. These events leave the skilled performer with little choice but to consciously override habituated modes of action. End quote. In these examples of required technique change, it is proposed that performers become more consciously aware of the kinesthetic differences between current problematic and desired actions. Quote, here, habitual actions are broken down into separate units, and this may involve freezing degrees of freedom in an effort to perform the desired movement. In this state, motor execution is rigid and inflexible, as the performer seeks to reparameterize action and gain control over movement proficiency. Considerable conscious resources are required. Performers undertaking this process would be positioned in the lower left quadrant of our model, characterized by high effort, low automaticity, and high control. In summary, de-automating an undesired movement pattern and re-automating a new movement requires a high degree of cognitive effort and control. End quote. Another area Toner and Moran feel requires an interaction between controlled and automatic processes is in experts mastering or continuously improving their skill. Quote, we argue that skilled performers are strongly motivated by a desire to master their craft, and this requires them to remain deeply attentive to embodied capacities. We refer to this process as continuous improvement and suggest that it's characterized by a desire to refine and update one's repertoire of skills. End quote. This is something another great thinker in this area we also lost this year, Anders Erickson, emphasized. He argued that instead of it being a hallmark of expertise, full automaticity corresponded to a state of arrested development, and that, quote, expert performers counteract automaticity by developing increasingly complex mental representations to attain higher levels of control over their performance, end quote. Similar to the first article I discussed today, Toner and Moran also cite flow as an evidence for this point. While original conceptions of flow focused on the lack of frontal cortex activation and reduction in conscious processing, which are characteristics associated with automaticity, more recent work has shown that there is considerable effort and cognitive control associated with the state of flow. For example, the work of Christian Swan and colleagues I discussed back in episode 58 suggests that flow is characterized by both high levels of automaticity and high levels of cognitive control, what they call making it happen. Quote, it's likely that in flow, a person is more open, more alert, and flexible within the attentional structure of the activity, end quote. The final aspect of skill the authors discuss is quote-unquote clutch performance and combating the negative effects of performance pressure. In Toner and Moran's view, overcoming distraction and being drawn towards task-irrelevant stimuli in high-pressure situations requires that an athlete exert cognitive control over highly automatic processes through strategies like self-talk or using cues to deliberately reorient attention to task-relevant stimuli. Another critical ability to handle these situations, in the author's view, is having variable, flexible movement solutions, which in their view comes from exerting cognitive control over well-established proceduralized routines. Quote, importantly, motor execution here is not of the brute, low-level reflexive variety, but is characterized by its variability and flexibility. We argue that clutch states will only arise if the movement system possesses the flexibility to tailor parametric control to the fine-grained structure of a situation. Skilled agents are capable of this because they possess movement repertoires that are inherently variable, owing to the physiological processes and environmental factors. And this allows movement outcomes to be achieved in different ways by dynamical movement systems. So the variability inherent in human movement systems means that the automatic basic actions can be adjusted in response to contextually contingent demands. That said, the athletes can continue to exert higher order control over the parametric details of the action. This performance state is characterized by high speed, high accuracy, flexible control over variations in a task, and effortful attention. End quote. So to sum up so far, Both of these papers pretty convincingly argue that traditional unidirectional linear information processing models of skill acquisition, where the desired end state is one of high automaticity and essentially zero cognitive control, are too narrow to capture what is going on in elite performance. Instead, skilled action in this approach needs a continuous interaction between controlled and automatic processes. The extent to which these two interact is determined by a metacognitive monitoring process, which takes into account the intentions of the performer and the cost-benefit of the different types of control. This system also monitors the outcome of the action. To quote the authors, conscious control is employed when these feelings make the performer aware of some change in the demands of the task. For example, the pace is too hard or the movement is becoming disfluent. End quote. So, if we want our movement to have some intelligence, flexibility, and responsivity to changes in the environment and changes in our intentions, all of which we know are hallmarks of elite performance, then full automaticity will just not cut it. Okay, so far we looked at automaticity in terms of the information processing models of skill like Schmidt's schema theory and Fitz and Posner's model. What does the ecological self-organization approach have to say about automaticity? Well, not a whole lot really. Not a big fan. In my interview with Keith Davids way back in episode 14C, this is what he had to say on the issue.
Some coaches go by default down to the rehearsal because they, in their minds, they have this idea that when they think about practice makes perfect, they're thinking that what that means is then you rehearse a movement pattern until it becomes automatic. And that word automatic or automaticity, as you sometimes read in the literature, I worry about that because if you or I, after this podcast, if you or I were to walk out of here and go onto autopilot throughout our daily lives, I guarantee within a few minutes we'd be in serious trouble because the environment's dynamic is changing and you've got to be able to adapt. You don't automatically, there's that word again that I'm not quite keen on, just pass the ball out wide because that was part of the game plan, and even though there was a gap that you could have run into to break the defense, you thought, no, I've got to stick with the game plan. So these teams are, this is where these athletes are top class, and for me that's where this perception-action coupling relationship comes in. They're highly attuned to the information that surrounds them, and that information, of course, includes the plan, if you like, the shared affordance that the coach would have talked about before the game.
If we use the strict definition of an automatic process, then it really has no meaning within the ecological approach at all. I wrote a book chapter a few years ago on movement automaticity, and I defined it like this. Quote, the term automaticity in sport is typically used to refer to the ability to execute a skill using no or very few information processing resources, i.e. attention and working memory. Automatic processes are thought to be ones that, once initiated, run to completion without further cognitive guidance by the performer. When a skill can be executed in this fashion, the performer has resources available to process other sources of information not directly required for the task. And, quote, in automatic processing mode, skill execution relies on motor programs or procedures, which once initiated run without the use of attentional or working memory. It has been proposed that through repetition of the skill during an intermediate associative stage of skill acquisition, motor procedures are developed as different subcomponents of the action and are grouped or chunked. When this chunking of steps is achieved, the performer need only initiate the procedure, rather than actively process each step. This can be conceptualized as a transition from multi-step to single-step memory retrieval. End quote. So you can see all of that description is firmly couched in information processing concepts. Memory retrieval, selective attention, a linear set of steps used to act, top-down control from an executive controller, working memory, motor programs, etc. None of these are thought to play any substantive role in the control of action in the ecological self-organization approach to skill. So the term automatic essentially has no meaning. Even if we take a more general definition of automaticity as being a less effortful, more routine type of skill execution, I don't think it really has much meaning in the ecological approach either. If we really believe that skill involves adaptability and having multiple movement solutions, then the quote-unquote effort involved doesn't really lessen with experience. It's just of a different type. This is wonderfully summed up in a quote by Rafael Nadal. You might think that after millions and millions of balls I've hit, I'd have the basic shots of tennis show up. That reliably hitting a true, smooth, clean shot every time would be a piece of cake. But it isn't. Not just because every day you wake up feeling differently, but because every shot is different. Every single one. From the moment the ball is in motion, it comes at you from a number of different angles and speeds, with more topspin or backspin or flatter or higher. The differences might be minute, microscopic, but so are the variations your body makes. Shoulders, elbows, wrists, hips, ankles, knees in every shot. And there are so many other factors. The weather, the surface, the rival. No ball arrives the same as another. No shot is identical. End quote. So, from an ecological viewpoint, the idea that the goal of skill training is to reach a stage of being automatic, where we are less actively engaged with our environment, is misguided. Skill is not a static thing you possess. It is something you must work to actively maintain and develop by attuning to different information sources, educating your intention, and continuously calibrating and recalibrating in response to the dynamic environment we live in. So pulling this all together, I think both approaches are saying similar things. Namely, the idea that skilled performance is automatic does not allow for the adaptability and flexibility required to be a top-level performer. The main difference is, of course, in terms of how this flexibility and adaptability is achieved. In the information processing view, it must lie in the brain, through cognitive mediation into motor execution through representations and metacognitive monitoring. While in the ecological view, being skillful lies within the entire system. That is, the relationship you establish between yourself and the environment. But either way, I think it's time to retire the concept of automaticity in sport. In one approach, it really has no special place, because even elite levels of performance are thought to rely on some level of cognitive control, while in the other, it really has no meaning whatsoever. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.